Year 1785, Edgefield County was a part of 96th District, which then included a very extensive territory in the upper part of the state. By the act of the legislature of that year, March 12, 1785, 96 was divided into the counties, afterwards called districts of Edgefield, Abbeville, Newberry, Lawrence, Union, and Spartanburg. Augusta, as we shall see, was founded in the year 1736, and a very active and important trading post had been in existence already for some years at the place of the Savannah, where Henneberg was afterwards built. Previous to its occupation by white people, the greater part of the territory was in the possession of the numerous and warlike tribe of Indians known as the Cherokee. The southern part, lying on the Savannah River, was used by the other tribes, Savannah, Creek, and Sea, as hunting grounds. Of these Indians, their habits, manners, customs, and traditions, it is not necessary at this time to write, as our purpose is to give a history of Edgefield as has been since its occupancy by Europeans and their descendants. Roving traders. For many years before there was any permanent settlement, the whole upper county was traversed by roving traders who brought skins and furs from the natives and made large profits by the trade. Beavers, buffaloes, bears, and other animals whose skin was very valuable, as well as wolves, catamounts, and wild cats, were quite as plentiful as squirrels and rabbits are now. There were also many wild deer, and at one time the exportation of skins from the state or colony ran up to as high as 250,000 a year. As far back as the year 1690, sometime before the English settlers on the Ashley knew that there was such a people in existence as the Cherokees, a man named Daugherty, a trader from Virginia, lived amongst them for purposes of traffic. From his time, many adventurers in search of trade and fortune frequented all the towns and warpaths of the nation. This trade, for some years, was very profitable, for the Indians knew little or nothing of the value of their goods, and for a few showy trinkets and gems of small value, the traders on the Savannah or the Catawba could procure peltries which he could sell in Charleston for many times their cost. One of the first settlers of the upper county, Anthony Park, who lived to a very advanced age in the adjoining county of Newberry, traveled in 1758 several hundred miles amongst the Indians to the west of the Allegheny Mountains. And even then he found several white men who said they had lived amongst the natives as traders 20 years, some 40 or 50, and one as many as 60 years. One of these traders had upwards of 70 descendants then living in the nation. These traders were mostly Scottish or Irish. These men, however, were not settlers in the proper sense of the word, although they had lived for so many years in the nation. They were only transit persons, pioneers of the true settlers living in the wilderness for the purpose of traffic, a love of adventure, and a desire to be rid of the restraints of civilized life. The territory of Edgefield was traversed time and again by those adventurers, as it lay in the direct line of route from Charleston and the Edgestos to the rich, game abounding country about 96 and the country above. From the best information obtainable, we find the earliest permanent settlers within the limits of Edgefield County were made about the year 1748. 96 was settled about that time. In May 1750, a party of Monongahela Indians, led by a Cherokee guide, passed down the savannah to attack the enclaves, who were the Anchis, who were friends of the English. These Uchis lived about 2 miles below Silver Bluff. The Monahagelis tribe was defeated and fled. The Uchis pursuing, they passed through the pine woods about 10 miles from where Hamburg now is, moving up in a direct line for the then weak settlement of 96. The pursuit was so close that the fleeing Indians were compelled to throw away their guns, blankets, and plunder. They avoided 96 and did not stop running until they reached the Cherokee towns. We find that 1 year later, May 7, 1751, Mrs. Mary Gould, called by Captain John Fairchild, Mrs. Cloud, living in Little Saluda River, was severely wounded by 2 Savannah Indians, who killed her husband and children, and a young man who was sleeping on the floor. These murders were committed treacherously, the savages having entered the house in a peaceful manner and having been kindly entertained by Gould and his wife. Several distressed families in that neighborhood then deserted their homes and retreated down the county to the Congarese to avoid the Indians. In August of the same year, Captain Fairchild informed the governor, James Glenn, that he had ranged with his company as high up as 96 and had built near that place a fort of puncheon logs for the protection of the people of that settlement. That fort was built on the north banks of Johns Creek, where a flourishing civilized settlement was founded contemporaneously with the first ever planted in any part of the 96th district. In May 1751, Captain Francis of 96 urged upon Governor Glenn to take into consideration the dangers to which the people there and on the Saluda were exposed from the incursion of the northern Indians and the French. In July of the same year, Captain Francis again wrote to the governor, urging the necessity of building a fort and of sending up a company of rangers to the protection of the people. The fort was built in August by Captain Fairchild. At this time, the Indians were committing considerable depredations. Indeed, from 1749, soon after the first permanent settlements were made in the district, to the close of Colonel Grant's campaign in 1761, there was not a family in all this part of Carolina that was not exposed to serious danger from the inroads and attacks of the savages. In the summer of 1753, Governor Glenn invited all the leading men of the nation to meet him in Charleston and hold a general conference for the settlement of difficulties. At this time, some Savannah Indians were held as prisoners by the governor for a depredation committed on the whites, and Little Carpenter, a leading chief of the Cherokees, said although he did not defend the Savannahs yet, if they are punished, the path will be made bloody, and no whites will be able to come to our country. You, he says to the governor, and those about you will be safe, but many a struggling white man will be his life. The conference was long and closed apparently all right, and there was expression of goodwill from both sides. But the goodwill was more apparent than real. A trader named McDaniel, who had come down with the chiefs, refused to return with them because he said it would be it would be certain death for any trader to do so while the Savannah were held as prisoners. We hear of these Indians again before they reach the end of their journey. They returned by the pathway or trail that led to the Congaree and to the Saluda Old Town. On the Little Saluda lived Stephen Holston. His home was not far from that trail. By the time the Indians had reached the Little Saluda, they had run short of provisions. The escort of 10 soldiers sent by the governor had left them at the Congarees, and there was no white man with them except perhaps the trader Butler, who had long been in their country. The Indians, 40 in all, stopped at Holston's, surrounded the house, and demanded a supply of provisions. Holston himself was absent, but Mrs. Holston readily supplied their wants. But in spite of her kindness, they continued to show a restless dissatisfaction, which it was impossible for her to appease. When night came on, 2 of them insisted upon being permitted to sleep upon the floor of the house. This, after some hesitation, she permitted. About midnight, when she and her servants were fast asleep, those outside surrounded the house, and the two who had been lying on the floor opened the doors, and the whole party rushed in, whooping and yelling and firing off their guns. Mrs. Holston was terribly frightened, and finding that they were about to force open the door of her room, she seized her baby, jumped from the window to the ground, and ran. She did not cease running until she came to the house of a neighbor several miles distant. The Indians did not pursue her, as they were not in a very bloody, thirsty humor, but only sullen and discontented. They contented themselves with robbing the house of all the pewter plates and dishes, teacups, and a kettle. They took also 30 bushels of corn, and two valuable mares from the stable. Mares. When Holston returned home, he found his property gone beyond hope of recovery. He laid his complaint before the governor and petitioned for indemnity, but whether his petition was ever granted does not appear. So we're almost done, at least for this segment. The reader will notice that amongst Mrs. Holston's house, mention is made of pewter plates and dishes. There are not a great many persons now living in Edgefield whose memory goes far enough back to remember when pewter plates and dishes were displaced by the introduction of Delftware. But it has not been so very long, nor has it been so very long since the old-fashioned flax wheel and distaff were a common use. The present writer remembers sitting at table and eating off pewter plates many and many times, and the heavy pewter dishes or bowls or basins in which food was placed upon the table. All were thick and heavy. I remember also seeing a strolling manufacturer with molds and who made thin, light plates and dishes. These, however, were not nearly so good and durable as the old-fashioned thick and heavy ones, though they were much nicer to look upon. When Delftware first came into use, I found it exceedingly difficult to hold my fork to its place whenever I tried to cut a piece of meat on my plate. It would slip and run away. With a pewter plate, there was no such trouble. The fork had firm holding grounds, as I could always make one or both its times stick into the metal of the plate deep enough to hold. I have betrayed myself again. Forks had only two prongs then. They were not split spoons, nor as well adapted to carrying food to the mouth as those in use today. We'll get back into building the Fort Kiowi on the next one. Appreciate the love. K. Cooley. We out.